Let's be honest for a moment. When the President of the United States looks into a camera and says another country's supreme leader should be very worried, that's not diplomacy. That's a warning shot, without the smoke. And this time, it's not coming during a campaign rally, not buried in a late-night tweet, not whispered through back channels. It's said plainly on national television, with negotiations just hours away and missiles quietly being rolled out of underground bunkers.
All right, President Trump has warned the leader of Iran that he should be, quote, very worried about a possible U.S. attack. During his wide-ranging interview with NBC News, the president claimed he had to warn Tehran once already after those U.S. airstrikes on its nuclear program. Listen.
Your understanding is they tried to restart it, and that's why you're threatening force.
They tried to go back to the site. They weren't even able to get near it. There was total obliteration. But they were thinking about starting a new site in a different part of the country. We found out about it. I said, you do that, we're going to do very bad things to you.
So the question is no longer whether the U.S. and Iran are on edge. The real question is who blinks first and what happens if nobody does. Because right now, the world is watching two countries sit at the same table in Oman while sharpening knives under it. Donald Trump didn't mince words. Asked about Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Trump said, very directly, he should be very worried. No qualifiers, no diplomatic cushioning, just that. Now, if this were a movie, this would be the part where ominous music starts playing and someone quietly locks the doors. But this isn't fiction. This is happening in real time, and the stakes are measured not in sound bites, but in cities, oil routes, and human lives. This warning comes as the US and Iran prepare for their first formal negotiations since the United States bombed parts of Iran's nuclear program last year, an event that already pushed relations off a cliff and then set the cliff on fire. And if you're wondering why tensions feel hotter now than they did then, the answer lies inside Iran itself. Over the past weeks, Iran has faced nationwide anti-government protests. Not isolated demonstrations, but widespread unrest. People in the streets. Anger spilling over. A population clearly saying they've had enough. The response from Iranian security forces was swift and brutal, a deadly crackdown. And that's when Washington stepped back into the picture. Trump framed his aggressive posture as support for Iranian protesters. He stopped short of direct intervention, but he did something else instead. He sent a U.S. military armada into the region. Now, when a superpower uses the word armada, it's never just for show. Ships don't move halfway across the world because someone felt poetic that morning. This was pressure. Calculated pressure, and Tehran noticed. Here's where things get complicated. On one hand, Iran is talking diplomacy, calm statements, carefully chosen words, officials saying they want a fair, honorable agreement. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arriving in Muscat with a full delegation, signaling seriousness. On the other hand, and this part matters, Iran quietly announced that it has deployed its most advanced long-range ballistic missile, the Khorramshahr-4, inside an underground Revolutionary Guard missile base. Let that sink in. While diplomats shake hands in Oman, missiles with a range of over 200 miles and a warhead weighing more than 3,000 pounds are sitting underground, fueled, tested, and ready. That's not a coincidence, that's leverage. It's the diplomatic equivalent of saying, we're here to talk, but don't misunderstand how serious we are. Now here's where the tension truly sharpens, because the United States and Iran are not walking into these talks with the same list of priorities, not even close. Washington's position, confirmed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is expansive. The US wants to talk about Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile capabilities, its support for armed groups across the Middle East, and its treatment of its own citizens. In short, everything. Iran's position, much narrower. According to Tehran, the talks are about two things only. Its nuclear program, the lifting of sanctions, nothing else. No missiles, no regional influence, no internal politics. And if you've ever tried to have a serious conversation where one person wants to discuss everything wrong in the relationship and the other just wants to talk about rent, you already know how this usually ends. Iran keeps repeating one phrase, and it's not accidental. Past experience. That's diplomatic code for we've been burned before. Tehran hasn't forgotten previous agreements, abandoned deals, shifting US administrations, and sanctions that came back faster than they were lifted. So while Iranian officials speak about peace and stability, there's an unmistakable layer of caution underneath. They are entering these talks with authority, yes, but also with deep skepticism. And that skepticism explains why missiles are being deployed at the same time diplomacy is being attempted. Iran is making it clear it will not negotiate from a position of weakness. Now, if this were just about two countries arguing, the world might shrug and move on. But it's not. This region controls energy routes, shipping lanes, and political alliances that ripple far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices react, markets twitch, allies start making quiet phone calls, China is watching, Russia is watching, African economies tied to fuel prices are watching, and countries like Nigeria and Ghana, already navigating economic pressures, know that global instability doesn't stay neatly contained. When oil jumps, currencies wobble. When sanctions shift, trade patterns change. When war threatens, everyone pays, even those nowhere near the battlefield. That's why these talks in Muscat matter far more than they appear on the surface. Trump's approach hasn't changed much over the years. Apply maximum pressure, speak loudly, keep allies guessing, and force the other side to the table. The difference now is timing. These warnings are not coming from a position of calm dominance. They're coming amid internal unrest in Iran, rising military deployments, and a region already stretched thin. Trump says his actions support protesters. Iran says any attack will be met with immediate retaliation, including strikes on U.S. assets in the region. So we are quite literally one miscalculation away from escalation, and history tells us miscalculations rarely announce themselves in advance. On Friday in Muscat, two delegations will sit across from each other. One side believes fear brings leverage. The other believes endurance brings respect. Above ground, there will be smiles, statements, and carefully phrased press releases. Below ground, there will be missiles, bunkers, and contingency plans. This is not peace yet. This is not war yet. This is the dangerous space in between, where words are chosen carefully, but weapons are already in place. We'll dig deeper into what these talks could realistically produce, who stands to gain, who stands to lose, and why the outcome may reshape regional power far beyond Iran and the United States. Because sometimes, the most important negotiations are not about what's said at the table, but about what both sides are quietly preparing for if the talks fail. We've walked through the tension, the warnings, the missiles in bunkers, the stern faces in Muscat. But now it's time to unpack the backstory, the real stakes, and the bigger picture that too many news headlines barely scratch. Because what's happening between the United States and Iran isn't just another headline about nuclear weapons or diplomatic talks. It's a storm with echoes reaching from Tehran to Tokyo, from Lagos to Lima, from Washington, D.C., right into your living room. Let's begin with a truth most news outlets barely mention. These negotiations in Oman, and the ones before, didn't start in a vacuum. They were born from months of broken promises, surprise attacks, and a cycle of escalation that nearly spiraled out of control. In April and May of last year, Iran and the United States were having multiple rounds of indirect nuclear talks. They weren't perfect. They weren't easy, but they were happening. And just when some progress seemed possible, something unexpected detonated all of it. A surprise military strike, led by Israel and supported tactically by the US, hit Iran's nuclear program deeply and suddenly. When the smoke finally cleared, planned talks scheduled for mid-June were canceled, and what had been negotiations ended up looking more like the opening act of a war drama. President Trump's words on this are chilling in their candor. Asked about why the US and Israel struck Iranian nuclear facilities, his answer was stark. If we didn't take out that nuclear, we wouldn't have peace in the Middle East, because the Arab countries could have never done that. They were very, very afraid of Iran. They're not afraid of Iran anymore. Those aren't just policy words. That's geopolitical mathematics, and a deep admission that the Middle East rests on fear, strategy, and shifting power balances more than treaties or trust. But here's the twist. Even after those strikes, even after Trump's ultimatum, intelligence reports suggested the US didn't fully destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. They slowed them, they damaged them, but they didn't erase them. So while Trump claims total obliteration, the reality is more complicated and more dangerous. Because while the big diplomatic speeches were happening, smaller, but just as dangerous events were unfolding on the ground. Take what happened in the Arabian Sea. A U.S. Navy aircraft carrier shot down an Iranian drone that approached its formation, described officially as aggressive and threatening.
U.S. Central Command said its warship, the Abraham Lincoln, was sailing around 800 kilometers from Iran's southern coast when an Iranian drone approached with unclear intent. U.S. fighter jets were deployed to shoot it down. Iran's Tasnim news agency reports the drone was carrying out a routine and lawful mission in international waters. Despite the incident, President Donald Trump told reporters talks with Tehran are going ahead.
Minutes later, Iranian boats from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly harassed a U.S.-flagged tanker as it passed through the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic choke point for global oil shipping. This wasn't a mishap. It wasn't a navigational error. It was a message, subtle but sharp, like the raised eyebrow of someone who's telling you they mean business without firing a shot. And in a region where one misstep can trigger a chain reaction, that gesture matters. Inside Iran itself, people aren't just facing foreign pressure. They're also facing internal control. Months ago, as protests swelled across the nation, Iran imposed a near-countrywide internet blackout. It silenced activists, cut off communication, and made it nearly impossible for ordinary Iranians to organize, share evidence, or even call loved ones. Connectivity has partially returned, but experts warn the situation hasn't returned to normal. The infrastructure that once allowed people inside Iran to see the world is still fragile. What's worse, even when the screens flicker back to life, the fear remains. Governments don't erase digital scars quickly. And this says something deeper than any headline. The conflict isn't only about bombs and missiles. It's also about control, narrative, and power over people's voices. That matters because when a government can turn off the digital pulse of its country, trust has already frayed. Let's take a breath and look at the bigger chessboard. Iran and the US are not the only players. Nearby countries have been trying to mediate. Not because they enjoy foreign policy lunches, but because everyone fears a wider conflict. A war in that region does not stay confined. It leaks into trade, oil prices, migration flows, military alliances, and global markets. The Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, all have been pushing for calm, urging both sides to avoid another showdown. Even regional powers that once stood far from the edge have suddenly found themselves leaning in, whispering, nudging, and pleading. Because everyone knows that the Middle East is like a packed theater fire alarm. One spark and chaos spreads fast. And that's where we stand now. Two delegations sit at the negotiating table. One side demanding a broad agenda that includes missiles, regional influence, and even human rights. The other side wants a narrow focus, nuclear program and sanctions relief. But let's be honest, talks in this atmosphere are like trying to negotiate peace during an earthquake. Everything shakes, everything shifts, nothing feels stable. The threat of renewed military action still hangs in the background. Trump's words, "If you do that, we're going to do bad things to you," echo like a warning we can't ignore. On the other side, Iran feels squeezed. From protests at home, sanctions choking its economy, and now a military buildup it did not invite. No wonder the world watches, uneasy. And that's the real story here. Not just nuclear talks or missiles or speeches, but whether diplomacy can succeed in a climate poisoned by mistrust, past betrayals, and the fear that the next misstep might be the final one. This isn't a simple negotiation. This isn't a UN press conference with scripted lines. This is a test of whether two longtime adversaries can put aside decades of hostility to talk honestly, or whether history will drag them back into confrontation. Can diplomacy win over deterrence? Can trust be rebuilt after threats and strikes? Can a region that has known war and tension for generations find a pathway to lasting peace? That's the question not just for America and Iran, but for the world. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was this negotiation real progress or just a pause before more conflict? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. If you found this explanation clear and insightful, show support by liking the video. And make sure to subscribe so you stay updated as this story continues to unfold. Because what happens here won't stay in the Middle East. It affects global politics, economies, and the future we're all heading into.